Hi, everyone. Welcome back to SIPNOC 2022. I'm Mark Robbins with the SIP Forum, and this session is entitled Compliance Engineering, How Engineering Organizations Can Implement Technology Complying with Robocalling and Stir-Shaken Requirements. It's my great pleasure to welcome Mark Lindsay, who's Senior Member of the Technical Staff at ECG. Hey, Mark. So great to see you.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for putting this all together and inviting everyone.
My pleasure. And I'm going to gracefully exit stage left, and the podium's all yours.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to go through a review of some of the key regulations, but my main contribution here is going to be to talk about how engineering organizations can effectively work with regulatory teams to bring regulatory knowledge and clarity into the engineering and the network design and the product design process. This is where ECG spends a lot of our energy and time. And so I'm going to show you a technique for mapping those regulations onto network engineering decisions and to bring clarity to the organization. And then we're, of course, going to apply that specifically to robocalling related laws. So ECG is an organization focused on voice engineering. So we do a lot of parts of the project will help service providers and large enterprises do the selection and the evaluation process of different technologies. We work with service providers to implement these. So a lot of times we'll come in and augment the engineering team. So if your engineering team is just too busy, it's difficult right now to bring in new talent. Well, we will do that network augmentation and providing services for enhancing your network with our team members who are highly experienced in this particular segment, voice and video network engineering, especially with connections to telephone networks. So we also do the acceptance testing a lot of times. That's a major part of it, is proving out that the product really meets the requirements and that it's both performing well, it's got the features that are there, it's scalable, that the cybersecurity implementation has been effective, and that we provide some extra eyes and analysis on the cybersecurity side, specifically for service providers. That's really our focus on cybersecurity for service providers, data center operators, internet service providers. And then we provide ongoing training and sustaining support. So I do a good bit of education myself, where I'm bringing engineers, product teams up to speed on something new that's been added to their network or some new requirements like this. So some of our recent clients are listed here where we do these same kind of projects. And we're proud to be part of the SIPNOC series of meetings now for many years, over 10 years. So our key point today is when we map network regulations onto network engineering, we can improve the comprehension of the resulting impact of those regulations. And I'll show you how you do that. So our first big phase we'll go through today in our time is mapping regulations on the network engineering particularly. We'll talk about common points of confusion, specifically around robocalling mitigation. And then I'm going to talk about smart ways for engineers and lawyers to work together. So our first part will be focused on mapping robocalling regulations onto network engineering. So our perspective here is that of a service provider in the United States who's offering service in the United States, regardless of where corporate HQ is. We're offering cell phone service that dials real E164 telephone numbers somewhere in the territories of the United States. So I need to say this material is just provided for information purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. ECG is a technical consulting firm, as I've said, not a law firm, and you should consult your own legal counsel. As I'm going to touch on at the end, I've worked extensively with regulatory attorneys. We work specifically with Marshall and Donahue, the ComLaw group, because they're very technical. There are partners for understanding and decoding regulations, and we work jointly with clients where we're doing the implementation and engineering. So we're going to walk through a tour. If you look at the bottom here, I'm going to kind of show you how this tour fits together. So we're going to first talk about calls coming from subscribers going to anywhere first, so no matter where that subscriber placed a call to. And then we're going to next look at calls from subscribers to other subscribers. And then last, in this section, we're going to talk about calls from subscribers to the PSTN or other providers, the next provider, as the FCC regs will say. And then we're going to look in our second phase on calls from the PSTN or other providers to anywhere, to subscribers, and then to other providers. So you can see here we're covering kind of a lot of categories. If you think about this last category, we're what the regulations would call an intermediate provider. If we look at calls from subscribers to subscribers, then we're really thinking about cases of calls that entirely stay within one service provider network and do not transit to another network. So you can get these slides, as Jessica has mentioned in the chat. You can get these slides and download them. And what I'm going to be walking through here is a diagram. We're going to look at parts of this diagram. You'll find this diagram in the slides, and in these slides, so if you click on these are citations to the Code of Federal Regulations. They're just abbreviations. But when you click on those, it will take you to the ECFR site, so you can read what these are. So we're going to just do this tour and walk through how these regulations affect the network implementation and kind of what engineers would see as a fairly familiar diagram format. And I think what you're going to find is that this way of approaching the regulations education will be really fruitful to help engineering teams and product design teams know what their rules are, and then be able to design services and evaluate vendors to be sure that they're going to bring compliance. So give an example of that. I've been at Enterprise Connect this week. I ran into a vendor who's offering an unwanted calling product, and there was a little bit of unclarity about some of these regulatory requirements. And I think simply because these things are actually really complex to inculcate this knowledge across the product teams and the engineering teams. So our first example we're going to look at here is subscribers with no calling identity override. So these are subscribers that are making calls to anywhere, and they don't have any ability to actually change their caller ID. So this might be your typical unified communications subscriber or a UCAS subscriber, where they are able to place calls, but they really only have one telephone number at the point where they're sending in their SIP invite. Again, we're talking about a service provider who's offering service in the United States, and you're going to find ways, if you are one of these service providers, where you offer some variant of a service that's not exactly the way I'm describing it. And that's actually exactly the point here. I'm taking a fairly generic view, but I want to circle back to that at the end and talk about, well, what do you do about your specific products and how your product set is something unique and distinct in the marketplace? Well, and how do the regulations map into that? And that's what this approach to diagramming the regulations onto call flows, that's what this is intended to solve. So first thing we'll look at here is that we've got a couple of types of subscribers here shown on the left that are making calls. One is I'm calling originating subscriber Alice with a SIP phone here, is making calls. And then we have another category here that I'm grouping together as functionally equivalent for our purposes here, which is an authenticated customer SIP trunk. So this is the customer session border controller, and they are sending inbound calls. And in both of these cases, this is a customer scenario where they do not have the ability to override their caller ID. So you might call these screened calls, where even though the SIP invites are coming in on a SIP trunk, you have some sort of screening in your network. So this represents the interface, probably an access session border controller interface where we're doing authentication. And one of the key points that's highlighted by these parts of the code are that the access for these calls needs to be authenticated. So when the regulations refer to authentication, there seem to be a couple of senses of that. One is authenticating the caller's right to use a telephone number. Another one that's related to that and really dependent on it is authenticating that we know the identity of the caller. And so that's what's happening here. We're actually doing both of those in this case. We're authenticating the identity of the caller. We know exactly which subscriber this is and which device they are, but also we know precisely which telephone numbers they're allowed to use. Now, the next piece that I'm showing you here is that we are detecting robocalling, and this sort of is one of the areas of fairly frequent confusion as I discuss this with our clients. Is that the robocalling detection is coming from subscribers. So this is what we would think of as maybe originating robocalling detection. So when folks think about originating, they often will sort of visually or mentally model it as the process of checking calls as they leave the network. And this is really showing you here, because of the implications of these rules, that we really are looking at calls as they enter the network from our subscribers. This is logically where we would, conceptually where we're going to look at the robocalling detection. So these are calls leaving the customer. So this is our customer here on the left, and they are leaving, so they're going into robocalling detection. And so that's an important distinction. We're not going immediately here to nuisance management. We're not going here immediately to SCIAS, where we're adding the stir shaken attestation. We're going into robocalling detection. We don't have any necessarily knowledge that these are legal or illegal calls until we do this robocalling detection. So I'm going to jump over and just show you here. So this is part of our diagram. Let's jump over and look in the diagram. We're actually up here in this top left corner. So we could call this the northwest corner of our diagram here. And what you'll find is you can click on these links. If we click on that section from the CFR, it's going to take you to the part of the ECFR that actually explains this. So this is actually part of my argument, that in consultation with your legal counsel, these regulations are meant to be readable, they're accessible, and they're in many cases very clear to engineering teams. And what I've seen the mistake a lot of times is that we have engineering teams that are not just going and reading the actual regulations directly, they're depending on someone to interpret them. And often that someone who's interpreting them doesn't have access to all of the product knowledge and all the network design information. So that's why I want to make this available. So you can do that by using that handout. You can go directly from these citations and jump directly into the Code of Federal Regulations and see what I'm talking about. So you can check my diagrams to see is the information that ECG is putting forward here, does this really make sense? Does this meet our network and our expectations? And so this part in the northwest corner is what we've looked at so far. We've looked at this originating subscriber with authenticated access, and that traffic is flowing into the robocalling detection part of the network. And I see we've got at least one of you out there who's enjoying coffee from an ECG coffee mug. So we will let you know, since you've joined our webinar, we'll let you know how you too can get your own ECG coffee mug when we follow up with you in email. So now we're going to look to another part of the network where it's a little bit more complex because the customer has more flexibility, and that's usually flexibility equals complexity in real world engineering and product designs. So here we've got a different kind of customer. I call them a B authenticated customer, but they have a flexible caller ID, and this is a SIP trunk. So this is the case where we know the identity of this customer, but they have some flexibility in their caller ID. So this is where the concept of authentication really kind of needs to be teased apart. One is, can we authenticate their right to place calls from a particular telephone number? And the other is, do we know exactly who this customer is? Do we have a direct relationship with the customer who's originating this call? And so these are kind of a couple of separate categories. And what we see here is that the regulations don't exactly seem to draw a clear line between these enterprise customers with flexibility on their caller ID and service providers. Or you could say of it another way, you might be a service provider selling SIP trunks, and your customers who are buying a SIP trunk from you are effectively reselling other service, and they are subject to stir shaken regulations. They're on this webinar as well, right alongside you, and they are potentially sending in identity headers into your network. And so that's what we show here, is that we have some scenarios where these customers they're authenticated. You might think of them as enterprise customers, but they're actually going to be sending you identity headers. They could have their own OCN, their own code taken because they qualify, but they're actually buying what you think of as an enterprise product. And I'm actually seeing that kind of scenario pretty frequently. So in those particular cases, we'll have the calls coming inbound, and we would see if it has the identity header, then we would send that into the SCIBS function at that point. And so this raises some questions about exactly how do we want to assess this. And then the other question is, what kind of headers are they going to be sending through? So is this a private or trusted network type of environment? Are they going to be sending as p-attestation headers, or is it going to be the identity header? So we have some open questions there that are discussed in some of our other presentations this week. But because these are also calls coming from our customers, and they are conceivably leaving our network or going to other subscribers within our network, then we're also performing the same kind of robocalling detection on those customers as well. So it seems to be the requirement that when the calls are effectively originating from our network, we cannot allow illegal calls to be leaving our network, and so we need to do robocalling detection. So this is another area of common discussion where you've got a customer who's sending in calls. They think of themselves as a service provider. They could be sending you some sort of attestation data. And the question comes up, well, when and where do we need to do robocall mitigation? When do we need to be detecting potentially illegal calls and effectively mitigating that traffic to keep it from departing our network, to going out to the PSTN? So that's another piece of that. So what we see here is this is all part of the same input into robocalling detection. These are 3 different kinds of customers that are sending us traffic. So now we've talked about these calls from customers going anywhere. Let's talk about this robocalling detection a little bit more. So there's a couple of key things that we need to think about. So up here on the top, we have the calls coming inbound from with a solid line. These are our, maybe you could think of them as attestation A customers. We know exactly which phone numbers they're using and the right to use them. And then we have calls coming in with the dashed line, meaning that they are, there's some question about the right to use the caller ID, so the attestation story is more complex. But when we go into robocalling mitigation, there's even some things here. So one of the key points in the regulations is this public-facing website, which is mentioned in the regulations, that identifies the single point of contact that can be used to investigate or remediate improper blocking or routing. So if this robocalling detection is happening, something is going wrong, then we need some way for outside parties, or in this particular case, our subscribers, to be able to contact us to investigate this routing on their own. Now, you might think that there's some tool within their customer service that's going to do this, but as I read this, it appears that the public-facing website is going to provide value to customers as well. They're going to be able to use this to get some assistance for their own blocking or remediation, blocking or rerouting problems that might be happening due to something that's going wrong in the robocalling mitigation. So they may provide evidence that these are legitimate legal calls that are being placed. And then there are some obligations on remediation, how rapidly that remediation needs to happen. You can read about those requirements. Now, the next phase after we leave robocalling mitigation is this optional phase of nuisance or spam management. And we've moved over now into thinking about calls coming from subscribers and now going to subscribers. And that's a key point, because nuisance or unwanted call management, prevention, rerouting, detection, all of that is something that's it's a service that we are optionally allowed as a service provider to provide to customers. And this is often a point of confusion when folks think about robocalling. They're thinking in terms of robocalling that are these unwanted calls, whereas the language of the regulations and rules is really focused on robocalling as largely equating to illegal calls. Those are the kind that we need to mitigate. This is the optional kind of nuisance or spam management that we are allowed to do. And there are a number of controls and interesting details that need to be made. So one is that this is optional, so service providers may do this. Another one is that consumers may need a way to opt out, depending on exactly how you do it. Consumers may need a way to opt out, and so we need some opt-out control that they can have. So in what I'm seeing in some of the service providers is providing a click-through interface to be able to opt in or opt out of the unwanted call management. We're also going to need some human nuisance calling analytics oversight. That's one of the requirements, is that there's human oversight of this process. And as we saw before, we have some way of doing remediation for improper blocking or routing. So if these are calls that are getting blocked or rerouted that should have been delivered to our customers, then outside parties who are making those calls need some way of remediating that. So they need to be able to locate that single party, that single point of contact within your service provider network in order to do that investigation and remediation. So again, as you can see here, you can read about my claims that these particular points, these citations and the CFR are applicable as you're looking through these and assessing the accuracy and applicability for your network. Finally, one key point I want to note is that we have to keep records of calls. So if you're an engineer and you're reading these regulations, you see I've got to be able to provide reports of calls for the past 28 days of calls that were blocked that were going to my subscribers. Well, that implies that I'm going to have to keep a feed of blocked call records. And so what we see is kind of a data flow element here, where we have our blocked call records that are leaving this. Now, there are some additional points that could be made, and we could enrich this diagram further with some annotations related to the 607, 608 response codes, and those are not shown here, but you should note that may be helpful in as you're working through this kind of exercise with your engineering and your product teams. Finally, this last step is that calls are delivered directly to our subscribers. And here we're showing a couple of different subscribers. One is just this terminating subscriber, conventional UC type customer, or a customer with a SIP trunk. And there's not a key distinction to be made between those two. I'm just depicting them both for clarity. So finally, if we put it all together, this is the part of our network that we have that is going to cover all of these calls coming inbound from our subscribers. So these are subscriber to subscriber calls. Subscriber calls, because they're coming from subscribers, we're required to do robocalling mitigation. Because they're going to subscribers, we're allowed to do nuisance, spam, unwanted call management as part of that. And again, when you look at this in the diagram that you have access to, you're going to be able to click on these citations to go look at these parts of the CFR and use that as part of your evaluation when you're looking through this. Now let's talk about this other scenario where we've got a subscriber making a call to the PSTN. So this is obviously different. We have different obligations here. You notice we do have the robocalling mitigation for the same reasons we mentioned. These customers may be making calls that are apparently illegal, or potentially meet our some sort of thresholds that are set by our reasonable analytics detection or AI-based detection that we're doing human oversight of, that kind of thing. And so ultimately, these calls are going to flow out to the PSTN. And again, because we're required to participate in the stir-shaken framework, we're going to be adding an attestation to this as we send it toward the PSTN, or what's sometimes called just the next provider, whoever that is, that next party that's going to take that call. So one of the questions that shows up here is, what level of attestation would we put on these calls coming in on this B side, the trunk? So where they have flexibility in placing their caller, changing their calling identity, can the service provider identify the customer of the SIP trunk? Well, if that's true, then perhaps that qualifies as a B level attestation. And I'll say that that's generally the approach that I'm seeing folks take at this early stage of the evaluation. And I know there's a lot of discussion about whether the C-level attestation makes sense, but I'm actually going to argue it's worth continuing to think about, as some will join with me in saying, because in some cases you're going to say, well, there's an originator of this call back behind this authenticated customer that I, as a service provider, don't have a relationship with. So if there's some sort of resale or reuse environment that's being allowed by my terms of service, and I have customers that are doing resale in effect, then even if they're not adding their own identity headers, I may have some obligation to add attestation, and I have to be realistic about my level of knowledge of this user. One of the most common forms of this is actually when we have customers, perfectly legitimate customers, who are using simultaneous ring type features or call forwarding features, where the call flows route through a customer's PBX, and then you get an invite from a telephone number that does not belong to this customer, but it's part of ringing the user's cell phone. And so what as the service provider, we're getting a call from a telephone number on the PSTN to a telephone number on the PSTN. And I have to decide what level of attestation to put on that. Do I really have a relationship with the originator of that call, when in fact that originator was trying to reach somebody at this customer side, and they live out here on the PSTN somewhere? And so we have effectively kind of a hairpin call. And I would say you want to think long and hard about this, claiming that you do have a relationship with the originator of the call, or defining the originator of the call to be the actual service provider or your enterprise customer potentially. So those are detailed conversations that you're going to want to have to get to the bottom of those terms, what it means to have a relationship in order to properly apply the standard. Okay, so now we're going to think about inbound calls from the other sources. And so we're going to have authenticated access from other PSTN providers. So I know there's this language in the standards that talk about the C-level attestation being appropriate for example, international gateways, and that seems to be the sort of the key example where that comes up. But I think there was a concept in some minds related to, as they read that, potentially thinking, well, we don't know the identity of these other PSTN parties that are connecting to us, but I don't actually see this being implemented as such in environments. no matter what size or scale of service provider you are, when you're getting SIP invites into your network and you're allowing them to flow through the network, you're authenticating the calling party in the sense that you know precisely who they are. Often that authentication is done through simple IP addressing, or it could be done through an IPsec tunnel, but you know precisely who that calling organization is. And so we always know that the identity of the caller. What we don't know, or say the identity of the calling system across an N and I, for example, what we don't know is with certainty is the identity of the calling party. By definition, these calls are coming from any number of other telephones, coming from any number of other networks, and they've reached us through a particular ingress point, through a particular service provider. So this is just in an effort to define what we mean by this PSTN inbound access. It's that kind of access where we're getting calls inbound. We don't have any relationship with the originator of the call, but we do know the identity of the SIP trunk operator. And so we shouldn't confuse ourselves. So this maybe a takeaway here is to think about what does it mean by authenticated access? Are we going to say authenticated means we just know the identity of the caller or the calling system? Or does authenticated mean we've proven that they have the right to use a particular telephone number? And you have to keep those two concepts separate. So for inbound calls that we receive with the identity header, we are required to verify those. That's part of the requirement here. And that came up with some of the recent rulings and publications from the FCC that actually mentioned this exact point, that we have search-taken service providers who are only doing the outbound attestation that have not yet implemented the inbound verification. But that inbound verification is a required part of that standard, as you can see here in this particular point of the law. So we have to do that verification when the identity header is provided. Now, what do you do with that? Well, technically, verification means at a minimum we're computing the validity of the attestation, which means we're checking the certificate. We're able to go retrieve the certificate. We're able to compute whether it was the cryptographic signature was accurate. We're able to compute whether the timestamp and the other information matches that data that's in the SIP header. So even if we're not doing anything with the resulting verstat data, or we should, I would say, from an engineering organization, we would want to be producing logs of valid and invalid information to find out, well, how well is our system working? How often are we able to go match these things up? How often do the digits that are in the origin telephone number match or not match the digits that are in the from header, and how often are country codes and E164 formatting or things like that becoming a concern? And so that kind of verification is at the very minimum required. So then we've got a scenario, now that we've done this verification, we've got a scenario where we're sending calls to subscribers. So this is the point where we optionally can apply the same nuisance or spam management. That's one of our options available here. Now, as I diagram it out here, of course, I'm showing sort of a different inbound path from calls coming from subscribers and calls coming from the PSTN. In the regulations, these are not described independently. As you'll see, they're actually the same citations that are used for both of those. But as an engineering organization, you're going to want to be able to diagram this out so you can tell the difference between them and you can think through the flows. And also these diagrams differences are going to be related to the way calls actually route through your networks. The access control list and the firewall rules and the SIP trunks and things that are happening in your network, these are going to be reflected by that. And so that's part of the value of this kind of approach is it starts to, it gets us a good step closer, just using the regulations, a good step closer to actually things that we can implement in real networks. So finally, these calls are checked by some sort of nuisance or spam prevention if desired, to look for unwanted calls or to label the calls. Part of your CVT platform may be used here to identify whether the calls are likely spam or we want to put a verified indicator or something like that on the calls. And then we can send this data out to the final recipient of the calls. So for example, this might be the phase where we take the verstat information, we take other information about the reputation of the caller, and then we determine what we want to actually display on the user endpoint, the UE. Now there's another flow, which is in the case of calls received from the PSTN, where there actually is an identity header provided. And in that case, we still have to do the verification, but we have to pass it through. And so in that case, we've got calls going to the PSTN, going to other providers. So in this scenario, we're functioning as that classic intermediate provider. The case here is I'm doing verification, I'm passing it through unchanged, and that unchanged nature is part of that requirement that I have to pass it through unchanged to the next provider. And so that's what is actually depicted here. When there's, we have this other scenario though, where we're receiving calls from a PSTN provider with no identity received. And of course, as an intermediate provider, since we're defined to be an intermediate provider when we're passing that call out to another provider, then we are required to go ahead and add the, do the attestation process, or we have to do STIAS. And that's again, where we get into this B versus C decision about related to our relationship and our level of knowledge and certainty of the right of the calling party to actually use that telephone number that they're calling from. So that's what this citation is about the scenario where we have to add that identity header before we can send the call outbound. And so that's why this we have the call flowing into the STIAS on the outbound side. So this is the summary of our diagram that's put together. So I think what I would encourage you to do is think about how does this compare to other kind of call flow diagrams. So what we've done is we've really started with regulations. We've, and we'll talk about the process here in a minute, but we started with the regulations and we've generated a model, a graphical model that depicts call flows and different calling scenarios through the network, and then annotated this call flow model with this particular points of regulation that are that either require that point or they have some impact on the way it works. So for example, the fact that the robocalling detection comes first before nuisance call management is implied by the fact that we actually have to use information from our identity verification, or we have to look at the user's right to use their telephone number as part of nuisance and spam management for unwanted call detection. That's actually one of the requirements. And so because that requirement is there, it forces the order of these two functions within the network. So you might logically think, well, I'd rather discard unwanted calls earlier in the network. Well, but if the regulations say I have to use the output of my robocalling detection, and in particular my verification process, and in that robocalling detection, then I am required to organize the call flows or the database lookups, the STIVS and database lookups in a particular way. So I'm not arguing, however, that you would do this as an engineer kind of all on your own and sort of put these things together. I am arguing that an engineer informed on the regulations will be able to make an engineering work product that will be useful for engineering, network design, product implementation decisions that will bring about compliance with these type of regulations. And that's particularly what I'm going to talk about here a little bit, is how do we do this. So my key contribution I'm trying to make is that we can demonstrate that these regulations can be mapped onto network designs that can be thoroughly useful for making engineering implementation decisions. A lot of what I spend time on is communicating with other engineering teams to be sure that they understand how this thing works, thinking through what our engineering options are that are actually, in these cases, allowed by the law, but also allowed by technology, what actually makes sense. So we've got to merge these things together to make actual working implementations. So how do we go about doing this if you wanted to do this yourself? I give you kind of a summary here of an approach. So really step one is truly engaging with attorneys to dialogue on call flows about these customer scenarios. So ask them clarifying questions from an engineering perspective, ask clarifying questions about the product categories that don't seem to fit the terms. So if they're using a term like subscriber and you're thinking in terms of a SIP trunk, are those really the same thing? If the law refers to consumers have to have the ability to opt out, is that the same as my UCAS enterprise? So those kind of questions need to be nailed down, because there really are a lot of terminology differences, and sometimes this terminology is just left to kind of the natural, clear explanation, and an attorney can help straighten those things out. As I mentioned, I work with a number of attorneys at Comlaw Group as part of my dialogue process on this over the past year as we've worked through these projects with our clients. The next step that I'm going to recommend after this dialogue and clarifying questions have taken place is for engineers to actually read those citations. The attorneys are always helpful in the sense of pointing you at their sources of truth. Where did these rules come from? Whether it was a report and order, or it was some specific interactions with FCC staff, or it was just the actual Code of Federal Regulations, things that have actually been fully documented and fully standardized and easy to get access to. Engineers actually need to read those, and that's a common mistake I see as an engineer among engineering teams. We don't tend to read those regulations very often and take them as part of our engineering design constraints very readily. The third phase is diagramming those network functions and labeling them with the appropriate legal citations that affect the network function. And so that's a key thing I'm trying to point out here, is that it's important, as you can see in this diagram, to keep track of what these are. So for example, this nuisance oversight calling, this mentions, as I clicked on that, go to that part of the CFR, and we can see that this is a network-based blocking with human oversight and network monitoring. So there are, constraints on that, and by documenting that, by keeping it, making it easy to jump back to the regulations, we reduce the likelihood of accidentally implementing something that doesn't quite fit, or implementing something that's not actually required, but doing it because we think it's required. So we want to stay really close and clear to what the rules are actually telling us, and that is one of the ways that working with an attorney is really helpful, to be sure that those things stay married together, because these rules, these regulations are truly complex, especially in the case of robocalling. There's a lot of regulations that do have implications on call routing and on how network functions are implemented. And so it's really easy to kind of get confused on these. There's a lot of parts and pieces. And so putting it in a diagram format, which engineers generally are pretty good at working with, is a way of capturing that. So after we've diagrammed it, we want to organize the call flows based on those implications. So in some of these cases, for example, we're going to see, well, I know that as an input to my robocalling detection, I'm going to have this investigation and remediation. And so I might be able to diagram this arrow, but then that will help you build out the rest of the network and what the order of things needs to be as you're working through them. So you can think of other particular scenarios where there's other sets of regulations that have implications on our network. So for example, rural call completion rules are going to have a set of implications on network. 911 compliance obligations, they're going to have a set of obligations on network engineering, and there are other requirements. Of course, this moves outside of this technique moves outside of simply IMS, UC type networks. You can apply the same kind of thing in mobile cellular networks, CMRS, and other types of network technology, where we need to basically track and map those regulatory requirements directly into their implications, so that we can have traceability back into the regulations. So that last step is effectively build the diagram that fully connects things logically, that allows our service to be provided, that retains its connection with the compliance requirements. So our last two sections here are actually a lot shorter. The next section I'm going to talk about is common points of confusion that we bump into. So a common point of confusion are the stir-shaken deadlines. So obviously the FCC changed the deadlines for service providers in the US. Many service providers have heard they have until June 30, 2022 to implement stir-shaken. However, I've actually had that question come in from service providers that actually operate facilities, or they purchase these facilities through an affiliate. Now, knowing precisely whether it's an affiliate and what those requirements are and how you do that is a detailed question. So some of the discussion points you might have around this are thinking about, how do you connect to your customers? Are you connecting over facilities Ethernet or TDM facilities that you operate? Do you have customer links, customers where you provide the actual network links to all of your customers access your voice services through networks with which you do not have affiliations, or are they coming to you over the internet? In particular is the common case there. So those are the discussion questions you would have to tease this out. So this is generally a common point of confusion. There's an impression among a lot of folks who are fairly new to this space that they really only have until 2022. But it's worth discussing to find out whether you fit in that category of a facilities-based provider that has until 2023 or a non-facilities-based that has until 2022. Of course, we're talking about the smaller providers at this point. Larger providers are already under obligation to do that and to continue to maintain it. Another common confusion is exactly who's a service provider. So many service providers resell SIP trunks to other customers who themselves operate equipment and resell service to others. And a lot of this has really become clear as and more prominent as these regulations have shown up. In many cases, you'll have service providers selling SIP trunks as a service, and they didn't really care what happened and how that SIP trunk was used. So you need to think about, are my SIP trunking customers allowed to resell services through the SIP trunk? Is there something forbidding them from doing so? Are they operating systems, network functions that could conceivably participate in the stir-shaken framework, or are they only operating effectively a paper trail, or are they operating devices that have no capability, that can never actually functionally participate in that? So if they're operating an endpoint, a Yealink phone, that's not going to have any capability there, is that really why they're operating, or are there actually some network functions that could conceivably do so? Are they actually selling service to other customers with which I don't have a relationship? So that's another question. Then that kind of comes out of thinking about the C-level attestation question: is do I actually have a relationship with everyone making calls to these SIP trunks? And do all of these calls exclusively transit my own network? That's one of those other questions here. Or are they actually routing in through other potential networks? Another common point of confusion is this question between robocalling and spam. So as a consumer, their experience with robocalling is the annoyance, but the FTC is largely using that term of spam or unwanted calling as part of the rules there. So many service providers are focused on reducing that unwanted experience of customers. Robocalling mitigation, however, is focused on the unwanted or illegal calls that your subscribers are routing outbound toward the PSTN. Whereas we use the terms unwanted or spam or nuisance call prevention, it's to apply to the optional filtering that you can do to protect your customers against that experience. And so as you can see in the diagram, those two things are really teased out. They're separate functions, they're separate regulations, they're separate obligations that go into those. So some questions here to sort of tease this out in your implementation. Would I be able to detect if my customers were auto dialing calls in violation of the TCPA? So if they're placing outbound calls, would I be able to detect that? If those calls were going to telephone numbers that are on the do not call list, if they were placing calls to numbers that are routing to mobile networks, would I be able to detect that? So that's part of the robocalling question. Will my monitoring for illegal traffic also detect fraud or swatting or other types of illegal activity that may not actually qualify as robocalling, high volume, high velocity calls? Would I also be able to detect that too? So as a service provider, I'm generally obligated to mitigate illegal traffic from leaving my network, and this fraud and swatting would be potentially a real consideration there. And then spam or nuisance calling, do I have a way of providing customers a report to tell them which calls have been blocked or rerouted? And so that's kind of on the other side of it as well. So those are just discussions to help you kind of tease those out. Finally, a common confusion point is this question of attestation only. There's a sense that I can do stir-shaken implementations where I am just doing the outbound identity headers and then I call it good. Well, that's an attestation only, and that's really implementing half of the actual rules there. So full implementation of the framework requires both attestation and verification. So are we checking every identity header? If we were having problems accessing remote certificates by the signers, would I be able to know it? If a firewall were preventing my SDI-VS from being able to go out to the internet and fetch that certificate, download it successfully, or if there was some problem with the TLS certificate on servers, no fault of anybody's, but the date the TLS certificate that's on the web server that's actually used to host the certificate has expired. Would I detect that? Would I get alarms or alerting about that? And then a related question is it appropriate to send identity or some other like attestation info on to the next step? I know there's standardization work that's going on. Would that be the appropriate decision to be made? And then when I'm receiving those, is it appropriate to receive a P attestation or origination ID type of information inbound from this other SIP trunk? Is that appropriate in my scenario? So those are some of the questions that I need to think about as I'm implementing those, and engineers have to sort of nail down decisions on all these discussion questions to define the state of the implementation that will be targeted. Our final part is on, this is very brief. I just want to touch on effective engineer-attorney interactions. This is an area that I think we as an engineering community, in particular, I'm speaking to you engineers, will largely be able to improve on in many organizations. So probably the worst way, the less good way of working effectively with engineers is for the engineers just to say, attorneys, just tell us what to do and we'll do it. But that kind of naively assumes that your product mix neatly fits into the mental model of the regulators. So it's very likely that what you're selling as a company is somewhat unique and a little bit askew from what the regulations say, or at least the words that are actually used there. And so it's a little bit naive to assume that there's a perfect, easy mapping so that attorneys could even do so, even if everything else were perfect. So there's another question: is this kind of this approach of attorneys just tell me what to do, and then we're not going to have any dialogue. I'm just going to take instructions and sort of blindly implement. That can force attorneys into either safe, kind of just to be safe type of conservative requirements, which might unnecessarily restrict your network operations. You might end up having to be told that you have to cancel an entire product line because it doesn't fit, or that it can't be implemented in a compatible way. Or it could be that you end up doing a lot of extra work and you end up doing a lot of SCI-AS calculations for things that actually don't need it, because these are, intra-network calls potentially. So that's another risk, is that it doesn't give the attorneys a chance to actually figure out what their best option is as they're representing you and helping your organization to do this well. And this also creates a false sense of compliance. So you can think that you're doing exactly what they said, but in many cases there could be mismatches there. You might have missed it. I know that many of the organizations that have gotten letters from the FCC recently worked with attorneys, but I think there was some breakdown here between what the attorneys were saying and ultimately what the engineers were able to implement. There was something that happened there, and so what we're trying to do is find better ways to make that work. A better strategy, I'll put on the right-hand side of the screen, would be to say, Mr. or Mrs. Attorney, here's one variant of the product. Tell us what we should be aware of and the questions you have. And so explaining your product, explaining how it works, and then working through what those questions that the attorneys have in order to help them build that mental model to understand what they need to know. So you want to walk through the different variations of your service and the different types of customers one by one. So these things need to be surfaced so they can be discussed. You need to allow the attorney to build a mental model of those regulations and then also of the network and services. So this is complex. Engineers spend, week after week, year after year, building complex networks. And so it's not going to be necessarily a simple process when a new body of regulations comes down to our industry like has happened. And dialogue is a great way to find the best match between the rules, the interpretation, and the implementation. So we really have to find kind of the best fit. I haven't seen many cases where we're able to find a perfect match in every case between every rule and every network service. Like I said, most service providers have some secret sauce. There's something special about the way that you're doing it, or the agreement that you have with your customers, or the way the customers provision themselves. And so that's going to have implications on things like your customer policies and exactly what you can expect from your customers, whether they're allowed to resell and things like that. So having that dialogue is really important. So thanks for listening in. I hope you're able to make use of this technique for bringing that knowledge and comprehension of regulatory knowledge into your network. I'm Mark Lindsay. I'm the VP of Engineering, but I would say more importantly, I'm a senior member of technical staff. I do engineering here at ECG, and I've also provided you with Trevor Wolford's account rep, his information. He'll be a good one to get in touch with if you'd like to talk about a project, if there's a way that you'd like to work on a regulations mapping, or if you just want to talk with us more about how you can do this and bring this type of technique to bear in your network. I hope you'll be able to make good use of the handout material that you can download with this package. That will let you actually get the slides and then also the diagram, which is clickable. It's an active diagram that'll take you to the Code of Federal Regulations. You can also get that later time if you're watching this video later at ecg.co/SIPNOC2022. So thanks, Mark. I appreciate the time. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for that great presentation. Really appreciate it. Thank you, and thank ECG for supporting SIPNOC 2022 as a gold sponsor. Again, very much appreciated. There are some comments that just came in that said great presentation from a bunch of folks, so I'm not the only one that thinks that.